I'm a little embarrassed. I'm glad that David Hanks isn't here. David Hanks, as many of you might know, is a design curator who's been connected for many years with the Stewart program that became the Museum of Decorative Arts, which has now been incorporated into the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal. We'll get to the story of this in a moment with images. He came to me a number of years ago and said that since the daughter of Alfred Barr had donated the furniture from his apartment to the Montreal Museum, he would like to do an exhibition recreating Alfred Barr's exhibition, and would we like to take it at the Museum of Modern Art. I said, actually, we're trying not to just have every exhibition be about an exhibition that already happened. Cyclicity is a little bit too navel-gazing and absolutely fascinating. Couldn't wait to see it. But I didn't think that it was something that we needed to do. You never get out of anything. The answer was, okay, would you please write an essay for the catalog? And in fact, of the 6 essays in what will be the catalog to the exhibition, and it is indeed very much a catalog, because in between the exhibition, between the standard format of inviting 5, what is this template of an exhibition catalog? Invite 6 people who are not working on the exhibition to write an essay, and hope it has something to do with the exhibition. The old exhibition that actually illustrates the objects that are in the exhibition, that kind of catalog is nearly dead. However, this is an old-fashioned catalog with catalog entries and these 6 essays interspersed. 3 of the 6 happen to be written by people who are currently in the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA. Myself, Julia Kinchin, who is the Curator of Modern Design, and Paul Galloway, who is the Study Center coordinator and probably knows more about the day-to-day history of the department over its more than 80 years than anyone. There are also essays on the Bauhaus. There is an essay on the furniture and the apartments by David Hanks. There's an essay by Donald Albrecht, which is absolutely wonderful, on the social context of Bohemian New York at this moment, with these 2 figures figuring into it, kind of their social circle. And what did I leave out? There's undoubtedly one other essay that I've forgotten. I write about the 1932 exhibition that Carol mentioned. Juliet writes about the other exhibition I hope I'll have time to talk about tonight, the 1934 exhibition. When David proposed this and I wrote my essay, I thought it's going to be a bit problematic, this book, because this is the most overstudied topic ever. We've been really waiting for people to give new syntheses from Carol's work, from all the people who reacted against this. And yet, in fact, the book bristles with all sorts of new insights, and it makes the whole event, maybe, if you go away tonight with a muddied vision of this topic, it's not only because I'm a rambling lecturer, it's also because that is actually what the book shows us. The polemical construct of the absolute clarity that Carol was reacting to as a youthful art historian is not really so clear when you put the whole thing in its context. So I want to try to dramatize that, bring out some of the points. I'm not going to go back over the book per se. I'm going to talk on the themes that it deals with across essays, rather than give a kind of following along the itinerary of the book. Speaking of itineraries, here we are. There's a lot of travel outside of New York that is involved with this. This is Philip Johnson and Alfred Barr. These are long before people traveled in running clothes on airplanes, on a boat on the Lago Maggiore on one of their many summer trips. It's also a different moment in museum history where museum curators went away for 3 or 4 months to look at things in the summer. Partners in design, Philip Johnson and Alfred Barr. For those in the room who have studied architectural history, the usual pairing is Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock. So the interesting thing in this book is the centrality of Barr to the architecture and design story with Philip Johnson. And Henry Russell Hitchcock, in these essays, takes a bit of a background role, perhaps inappropriately so, but it is one of the things that offers a new vantage point. We need to start with the Bauhaus, and there is a real justification for this Bauhaus essay in the book. The book is very focused on the furniture for the most part, and much less to do with maybe some of the well-known stories, but I think it's worth putting them back in. The Bauhaus is absolutely central. Not only are there trips to the Bauhaus by everyone involved, it was a kind of mecca for them, the Bauhaus in Dessau. They arrived too late on the scene. They're much too young to have known the Bauhaus in Weimar. That's perhaps also why they're quite open at the end of my story to Walter Gropius's complete rewriting of the history of the Bauhaus using MoMA to achieve that end. In any case, the Bauhaus had an absolutely enormous impact on them. Alfred Barr wrote a letter to Walter Gropius in 1938 in the lead-up to that seminal exhibition on the Bauhaus, which I hope we'll end with. And he says, "I regard the 3 days which I spent at the Bauhaus in 1927." You can imagine him standing here on the famous staircase looking out to the workshop block. "I regard those 3 days in 1927 as one of the most important incidents in my education." That was in 27. By 29, Philip Johnson made his second visit to the Bauhaus, and he would go nearly annually until it closed. He went first in 1929. He doesn't mention the director, who is Hannes Meyer. He's going to be one of the many people instrumental in writing Hannes Meyer out of history. But he recounts his visits there on numerous occasions. And so the Bauhaus became something of a model. Not simply architecturally, not simply, as we'll see in a moment, for what was just coming to an end in 1927 when Barr arrived. That's a key moment. 28 is a moment of a kind of great exodus from the Bauhaus. Most of the people who are going to end up in our show in 1938 left Dessau in 28. Barr met them. Johnson and Hitchcock did not meet them in situ, but we associate it so much with Marcel Breuer's tubular steel furniture. But I think even more important is the fact that the Bauhaus, Barr basically gave himself the question when he received this call, 29 years old, in 1929, will you be the director of our brand new museum founded by these three extraordinary women around Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who wanted to create a museum of modern art, that he would not take any existing museum as his model, but rather he would try to imagine what would the Bauhaus be if the Bauhaus were to be a museum. Now, at first glance, and in most books, that sounds incredibly paradoxical because the Bauhaus would seem to be anti-historical. It's actually not true. We now know that Gropius was planning a Bauhaus museum. From the very first, Gropius was collecting the materials for his own museum. But I don't take us too far away from New York. This is perhaps the most famous of the countless diagrams that Barr drew in imagining what such a museum would be like. And very famously, it is the museum, and of course you can see he's drawing this up right around here, and he imagines the museum as a torpedo. We're in the interwar period, so it's not militaristic, but what he is interested in is, of course, the velocity of the avant-garde, to be sure, but he is interested in how you can make a museum that is constantly has its focus on the present and the immediate past. So the most radical thing about this is the notion that, I think a whale would have been better, actually, that the mouth of the whale is going to take in an enormous amount of material, but gradually one will discern what really matters and will throw off what does not. So the museum was posited on the notion not only of celebrating the present and its immediate genealogy, but on a radical policy of deacquisition. Once materials became some 30 years old, they were meant to go to the Met or to the Whitney. This began to take place. The idea of giving up the Demoiselles d'Avignon and losing the origins of Cubism blew that plan, so to speak, out of the water. And with that, the Museum of Modern Art actually changed fundamentally from Barr's original conception because the tail has never gotten narrower. But that was his interpretation of the Bauhaus. But even more importantly, what he did not diagram is not this, which largely deals with trying to figure out the relationships between various schools of painting, along with deacquisition, but that a modern museum would have to have departments that didn't exist in other museums. And these would include photography, cinema, but for our purposes, most importantly, architecture and what initially was called industrial art, which came with time to be known as design. Almost every one of those departments would not be founded in 1929 because there were very interesting debates with the trustees whether each of those media could come into the museum. The ones we're interested in, architecture and design, were first tried out on a trial basis. So nearly every book that you read that tells you that the exhibition known for shorthand as the International Style Exhibition was the first exhibition of the Department of Architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, the first ever Department of Architecture in an art museum, is false. There was no Department of Architecture. It was a trial balloon to see if people would come to an architecture exhibition. Carol and I know that problem very well, and it dates to 1932. Likewise, what we'll also look at, machine art was a trial balloon to see if people would come to an exhibition of industrial design, although there were many more precedents for such an undertaking. One thing that is wonderful in reading this book is it does remind us of something that is very much lost in hindsight. Today, I can't go out of the house for fear of being heckled for having had an association with the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art is a big, powerful, antagonistic, aggressive, domineering, hegemonic, canonic institution. In 1929 through the 1930s, the Museum of Modern Art is a very fledgling affair. It is never all that certain whether it's going to be around for all that long. And I show you this to say that we must forget about the Museum of Modern Art in its expansions after its building, which are primarily post-war. We have to go back to this moment when it is highly experimental, but also highly fragile. The deacquisition policy already suggests a certain amount of not only agility, but it may be even a certain amount of insecurity, as much as one would need to have when you have the backing and ultimately the real estate of the Rockefeller family. This is not the first home of the museum. So the book takes us very nicely to the geography of the early years of the Museum of Modern Art. I think we could say that what it is looking at is opening up a new perspective that the museum in its early years, particularly from the point of view of Johnson's relationship to Barr, that is to say the relationship of architecture and design to the larger project of this comprehensive, the media of modern expression museum, had two temporary embassies, perhaps a kind of embassy and a consulate. The embassy was set up initially on the 12th floor of the Heckscher building, on the corner of 57th and 5th, not yet gilded by Leona Helmsley, but still a very French Renaissance affair, not the most logical envelope for the project of the Museum of Modern Art. Slightly more in that vein is what David Hanks and his project bring in as the consulate, if you will. And that is this book for this building by Emery Roth, designed in 1927, the very year that Barr went to the Bauhaus, and in which the Barrs and Philip Johnson took apartments one above the other in the early 30s. So this is when they were at home in New York, this is where they met. But quickly they were going to turn this not only into a private place, but into a kind of annex in a certain way, or even a preparation of projects for the Museum of Modern Art. That, I think, is one of the book's great contributions, to bring this other address into the New York geography of the invention of the Museum of Modern Art. So we have to think about some of these interesting contrasts. I always think that had this exhibition, Modern Architecture International Exhibition, Architecture since 1922, had it taken place in Walter Gropius's Bauhaus building in Dessau, big deal. But imagine the shock of taking the elevator inside this French Renaissance chateau skyscraper, one of the first setbacks. Carol can tell us more about that. And to come into a room in which all of the architecture on display was a critique of the very building that you were in. It's that contrast, I think, that is extremely interesting and too often forgotten. And likewise, even if Emery Roth had some Parisian-style large-scale atelier windows, the building was, in fact, much more moving in the taste that our new disciples, these former Harvard apostles, were going to want as they moved into their relatively modest quarters. Here you see the floor plan of the apartments, the identical apartments of the Barrs and Philip Johnson. The Barrs were into procreating, so this was not so great for them. Philip Johnson that wasn't his thing. And here they are, the Barrs at home. So it's these photographs that are among the most interesting new documents that are brought into this book. And here is where it gets really interesting. So this is Margot Barr and Alfred. You can see that even though they were married, they had also very activities that led them to great introspection, and they managed to find their own worlds within this small apartment. But they also furnished it with very interesting furniture. This is probably the advice of Philip Johnson. This is a niche chair. We're going to see it reappearing. But the rest of the furniture, and this is really this is like red flag what goes on in this book. The rest of this furniture is largely by Donald Deskey for that which can be identified. So that everything that we think of as the opposition between Art Deco and a kind of international European modern is contradicted by this fascinating adventure into the furnishings and the interior layout of the consulate, the two quarters of the council and the sub-council of the Museum of Modern Art. Here is the various parts of it, and here's Donald Deskey, table and chairs in the Barr apartment, circa 1934. These are American chairs. These are not the Breuer Bauhaus chairs that you see here. We'll return to this in the 1930 Werkbund exhibition in the Grand Palais in Paris. Some more views of the Barr apartment. I don't know who the photographer is, but some rather fascinating photographs of the apartment. This is the work area. This is all American furniture there. And this is Philip Johnson's apartment. So the exact same floor layout, but now the furniture is not American furniture. It is all something that the Barrs could not afford. It is the very first Barcelona chairs ever on U.S. soil. In fact, the Barcelona chair was never industrially produced until it was taken up after the war. Likewise, many of Mies van der Rohe's pieces, not tubular steel, but this extraordinary flat steel. We have one of these in the collection of Philip Johnson's. It's recently been sent to be X-rayed because there is somebody who's trying to figure out, well, take it off, that connection, which is different in every chair. So they were all handmade. They're not mass-produced furniture.
Is this 1927?
This is 31, 32. Yeah. Those dates are not their dates. Where you saw the 27, that's the date of occupation. That's not the date of the actual furniture. So Philip Johnson's apartment actually was designed by Mies van der Rohe. So it was the first work by Mies van der Rohe in the U.S. Mies had never been here, but he designed it for Philip Johnson in Berlin with an office associate, and obviously also under the influence of Lily Reich with this use of hung fabric to transform the space. Here's the work area of Johnson's study area with his bookshelves behind. And here is the actual design of the bookcases, which are in the Mies van der Rohe archive today in the Museum of Modern Art. He was not only using this as an embassy, but he was actually preparing. He wanted, by the time the 32 show opened, to have work to show on American soil. The best way to do it was to commission it yourself or to have your parents commission a house by J.J.P. Aud, never to be built but included in the 1932 show. He also had in his apartment something a little bit too monumental for the ceiling heights here, Oskar Schlemmer's famous Bauhaus staircase. We can talk about that later if you want. It's a very fascinating history of how he had purchased it for the Museum of Modern Art, but kept it for a while. Let's turn then to the subject of these people as curators, and to the paradoxical issue of the architectural exhibition, and moreover to the incredible, once again, seminal status that the 1932 exhibition, always inaccurately referred to as the International Style Exhibition, holds as a point of origin. That too, I think, needs to be modified to a certain extent. Here is a page from the catalog that accompanied the exhibition, and the very first line, which I know from press release documents is actually written by Alfred Barr: expositions and exhibitions have perhaps changed the character of American architecture of the last 40 years more than any factor. So the 1932 show is immediately announced to us as a phase of a history that's at least 40 years old. The Chicago Columbian exhibition of 1893, and then if we come down here, strangely enough, it was in, this is for you, Carol, it was in the field of skyscraper design that our complacency was to receive a severe jolt. In 1922, there's one of the reasons why the exhibition starts in 1932, the competition for the Chicago Tribune Tower, another exhibition. So this exhibition that Louis Sullivan set back the American architecture by some 50 years, now 40 years old, and of course the display of the Chicago Tribune Tower. Interesting that this was Walter Gropius's standard portrait of himself standing in another exhibition, since this photograph was taken in Dessau. And I just want to very quickly show you some slides, because I think that too often, particularly in American architectural history, the 1932 exhibition is seen as some starting point. It is, in fact, at the end point of an extraordinary decade of exhibitions, particularly in Europe, and experiments with exhibitions. And indeed, the very term international style is derived from the Bauhaus presentation of a notion of international architecture. So yet another relationship to the Bauhaus, particularly in its seminal exhibition of 1923, done to prove that the first 4 years of its existence were not a waste of the government money of the state of Thuringia. Here are some of the posters for it, the catalog. There is the Bauhaus, as it was in the Henry van der Velde building at Weimar. And this is an extremely interesting exhibition because I'm actually writing a book, maybe we'll come back and talk about it when it's published, on the history of architectural exhibitions. And this moment is a kind of catalog of all of the forms that the impossible idea of having an architectural exhibition can take. You could transform the building. This is the graphic design students with Herbert Byers and others. They're designed for murals on the staircase to transform the staircase of the Van der Velde building into a 1923 expression. This is the actual exhibition of the student work in specially designed cases made by Marcel Breuer, who was at that point a student in the school. This is the design, I want to bring this in because this is a really interesting point, of the ceramics workshop. And all of the ceramics that they were working on, although they're frequently called expressionists, were actually meant to be modular so that the different pieces could be used and recombined. So very similar in that way to something we'll see in a moment, the idea of modular housing. Walter Gropius had his own office redone as an image of a total modern environment. So this is the first period room of yesterday, if you will. That's been studied many, many times. I don't want really to get into a Bauhaus lecture so much as to show you this extraordinary activity of exhibiting architecture and design of which the Bauhaus legacy was available to Johnson and Barr particularly. We'll see when we turn to it that Hitchcock was the ideas man. Johnson and Barr were the visual types. They were the people who would have installed this space. They would have thought of the greatest impact. They were really the public impresarios. Here's Gropius's office as drawn for the catalog of the exhibition, which came out late. Talks about De Stijl influence. 1 year earlier, the De Stijl exhibition that had, in a sense, given the movement its name in the Rosenberg Gallery in Berlin, in Paris. Extremely interesting because Mies van der Rohe is in this exhibition along with the Dutch. All of this in the 20s. This is a fragment of what's going on in this period. And because there was no architecture exhibition yet in the Bauhaus, Gropius's own office, and particularly the Hungarians who had come to work with him, showed what they were doing. This is not really student work like in the rest of the exhibition. And in particular, they showed their designs for modular, prefabricated housing, so-called Baukasten, or building blocks that might be built as a system. And then, it's a very complicated story, but essentially decided to build a one-to-one demonstration house, a form of house demonstration as exhibition project that goes back to the 1851 World's Fair in London, the Great Exhibition, taken up again here in this house by Georg Mücke, and furnished entirely by the members of the Bauhaus to be a showcase for Bauhaus furniture, much of it by Breuer and by the absolutely extraordinary Alma Buschert-Seedhoff. This is the unit for the kindergarten which recently was rediscovered because it had been hiding for many years in the family of Nicholas Pesner, who bought it at an exhibition clearance sale in the end of 1923. It is now back in the house. We don't need to be, Hitchcock's range of motion is much more Paris, Netherlands oriented. 1925, also the year of the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, with Corbusier's opposition pavilion to the dominant Art Deco style. And we could go on and on. 1923, again, back to the Bauhaus. Gropius decides, since the students aren't producing exhibition architecture, he will produce an exhibition of international architecture. I show you this because this is the seed of the idea for the Museum of Modern Art. The Here is born, the 1932 show, already in 1923. Gropius, the Bauhaus Siedlung are here, but also the Amsterdam School. Frank Lloyd Wright is asked to send in things. Things are sent for all over. They don't make these great trips. They don't have Rockefeller backing, but they call through correspondence. They bring people in to give lectures. It is a great week about modern architecture. This we just rediscovered. This is a very interesting story in the archives at MoMA. That is actually, it's in another view. You can see it on the wall. This is the model of it, but that actual drawing was in this show and then reappeared in 1938 in MoMA. And it also reminds us of the dangers of black and white photography, both of this show and of 1932. This is Farkas Molnar, the Red Cube House, and a project for an ideal Bauhaus house and garden. Here is another part, the vestibule of the room that we were just in, where Gropius and his rival, this is also for you, Carol, Mies van der Rohe, put Chicago Tribune versus the second version of the Friedrichstrasse, and what we don't know, where it went, the model of the concrete office building of 1923. So Mies gets into this exhibition. This was very meaningful for Mies, because Gropius had rejected him a few years earlier from the exhibition of unknown architects, and Mies began to craft these 5 projects that were going to be so important for Philip Johnson: the glass skyscraper, the concrete office building, the first redrawn, this is not the drawing that was submitted to the exhibition, Friedrichstrasse, glass skyscraper, the concrete house that replaces the drawing that had been rejected from the 1919 exhibition, and here again, the concrete house, and then the brick country house. So these 5 projects all coming out of what we might say, by the time Ludwig Mies van der Rohe has himself photographed in front of the Barcelona pavilion. You see he's the second architect to have his official photograph taken not in front of a permanent building, but in front of an exhibition, Chicago Tribune. So we might say, in the Bauhaus was born the notion of the exhibitionary architect, the architect who will make fame, take positions, be known in the world, not necessarily through an actual construction, but through the projection of possibilities for architecture that can be put on display. All of this is the ammunition for Barr and Johnson's belief that a Museum of Modern Art could have an architecture department, even when the trustees said, how are you going to do that? You can't bring buildings into the museum. By the time Johnson is cooking up the international style, Mies van der Rohe is the director of the Bauhaus. He has just completed the Barcelona pavilion, and I think that we are going to as well see, I might not have time to expound it fully tonight, but a slight tension between Barr's alliance with Gropius and Johnson's alliance with Mies, but that doesn't really come up in this particular book. I think it's a subject to be dealt with. One last element from our 1923 exhibition. It is the birth point of the idea of the Bauhaus Bücher, the Bauhaus books. Number 1 was Internationale Architektur by Walter Gropius, essentially the forerunner of the publications that accompanied the 1932 exhibition, and also the rationale why, if you know the early Museum of Modern Arts publications, they are numbered and all identical in page trim size and binding, to emulate the idea of the Bauhaus books. 1925 is that book, and let us get then to New York, and I think that explains why, if you get the right optician in New York, you can get an architecturally special optician, and they'll say, is your prescription right? What can you read in 1895? What can you read in 1905? Big. Negro sculpture, red, machine aesthetic. Modern architecture is the only thing that's not still evolving. It has achieved stasis in 1925. When the Bauhaus is built, modern architecture has come into a perfectly rectangular finished form. There is the Bauhaus, Purism, and Gestalt leading into the formation of modern architecture on the cover of Alfred Barr's catalog to the 1935 Cubism and Abstract Art show. So there it is. That is, even though this is 3 years later, that is what is taken up in this exhibition of 1932. That's what I have written about in the catalog. This is one of the most studied and still often misunderstood, surrounded by myth, events in American architectural history. It's a bit like the Barcelona Pavilion actually itself. Its fame has very little to do with its physical reality because it has mostly been interpreted by people who never saw it. This is the cover of the book, Modern Architecture. It is the product. Barr is the inspiration for it. He writes the preface. We've just seen the first line of it. The authors are Henry Russell Hitchcock. I love this photograph of him. He is in his library in Connecticut, and where has he attached the right side of his brain to the volumes of the Populaire Kunstgeschichte. Henry Russell Hitchcock, being a very methodical person, must have them in chronological order, so that volume must be Platz, die Baukunst unserer Zeit, which is the book he wants to rewrite in English, in a series of publications and in an exhibition project. Philip Johnson is off trying to get a doctorate, it never works, at the University of Berlin, with his camera and his car, driving people around to photograph the origins of modern architecture as suggested by Hitchcock in German Romanticism with the buildings of Ludwig Persius. Famously, he took Mies in his car and said, "Mies, I want to know about your love of Ludwig Persius." And Mies said, "Who is this Persius?" So, Hitchcock's big publication project, already 1929, appears his rewriting of Gustav Platz, Modern Architecture, Romanticism, and Regeneration, the first of a 2-volume series that was meant to be completed by an earlier volume. This is 1850 to the present. He wanted to do 1750 to 1850 as the prelude. It would never come out. Johnson told him, "You know what? Your book is a little hard going. It's not going to work as the apostles, as the New Testament. Maybe it's the Old Testament. Maybe we can have a little Talmudic discussion about this in a university seminar, but it's not going to win converts. We need to regenerate this book for a wider audience if we are going to turn this into a cause." And that is Johnson's thing. Of course, if any of you have read the wonderful book by Nicholas Fox Weber on Apostles in America, or Four Apostles, recounts this earlier history. And this becomes the book of the exhibition, published on the occasion of the show. This is just to remind us again of the point I already made, the Heckscher building, and the extraordinary contrast between putting the Bauhaus, even with a skirt, in a neo-Renaissance tower. Here is the plan as reconstructed by Terry Riley on the 50th anniversary of the show to try to show what was there. Now, if Carol wanted to host a 3-week seminar, we could undertake an absolutely extraordinarily interesting exercise. First essayed in 1982, this is for the 60th anniversary, Terry reconstructed the show and did a kind of show of the show at Columbian. For the 50th anniversary, there was an event up at Harvard in Skyline magazine in which Suzanne Stevens analyzed for the first time the wild discrepancies between what was in this set of rooms on the 12th floor of the Heckscher building, what was in the catalog of the exhibition, which is not the same, and what is in the book that you all think is the catalog of the exhibition, the International Style, which was a further popularization, which is, again, really quite different. And the differences between them are very revealing. We can't do that. The themes of it are the themes of my essay, with what it suggests, but let us just say, if you want to delve into it for yourself, it is, I think, further substantiation that this is a fluctuating affair. It is not an absolute canonization because there is so much difference between who gets in where. There are a lot of young American architects here. For instance, there are many more Americans in the show and in the book. The book is 50% American architects. So the notion that the exhibition was about excluding Americans and advancing Europeans is a complete myth. This becomes the characteristic of the book, The International Style, which was not published by the Museum of Modern Art. It's actually a completely independent parallel project of Hitchcock and Johnson. Here's the book, here is the exhibition. We'll return to that in a moment. Here's the table of contents, and as you can see, all of these people, Raymond Hood, Richard Neutra, of course, Frank Lloyd Wright. It's about 50-50, and moreover, there is an entire section on housing written by Lewis Mumford, Philip Johnson, and Henry Russell Hitchcock. Here is the book that everyone thinks is the catalog to the exhibition, The International Style, Architecture Since 1922. It takes up the name that is explicated in the earlier book and makes it into the title. It is also why many people think that the three principles that are enunciated in this book, published by Norton and almost continuously in press since it first appeared, even though for many years the catalog of the exhibition became something of a rarity, so this stood in for that. This is the book that gives the three principles, and there are actually many things, not only in the exhibition, but actually in the book that don't really hold up. So if this is volume rather than mass, what is this stone wall about? In Corbusier's most recent work, the Mandrel House, moreover for the patron of Siam, if everything is rational, what is this surrealistic project? So there are many, many contradictions between those thoughts and the books, not the least then the role of a curved wall and a stone wall in a project, the only project shown from Europe that hasn't been finished, which is Corbusier and Jean Honoré's Swiss pavilion at the Cité Universitaire. That's fascinating because it appears here. You can see that even though the drawings were sent to the museum, they were rephotographed so that they would be exactly the same size as everything else and put in a closet. They were put in they were put in the collection in the 60s once there started to be a collection. The Department of Architecture was not founded to collect, it was founded to proselytize and to circulate. Here's the Bauhaus room and some of the other rooms as it appeared. Here's the JJP Alb room. So major figures. The exhibition was organized by major figures. The International Style book is not. And Frank Lloyd Wright got his whole own room, which went all the way back to the Rovey House, but of course included his most recent projects in Tulsa. It was one of the last times that Frank Lloyd Wright ever allowed his work to be shown with other architects. He almost, throughout his life, tried to avoid having his work mixed in with others, largely because of the sour feelings he had from being cast as a grandfather of the young people in the exhibition. Some more views of the exhibition and reminding us, therefore, of people who have fallen out of history, the Bowman brothers, here with the design for Evanston. So there were actually quite a number of projects that had not been finished. This is the Helen Lescaz room. And then the most interesting is this single room that was largely given over to Lewis Mumford with the advice of the very young Catherine Bauer on housing. This is completely different because now the same sized photographs are no longer of this is a really interesting thing, I think. They are no longer of buildings that you're supposed to admire. They are of neighborhoods in New York that are supposed to appall you by their squalor. East 86th Street and Astoria, juxtaposed with Hassler's new housing project just finished in Kassel in Hessen in Germany. And these are the photographs that are on the wall. Long Island City, contrasted with Sunnyside Gardens as a positive example, and JGP Out housing example. Here are the photographs in the housing exhibition. You see New York slums, New York super slums, Park Avenue district, and our great hero, Catherine Bauer, who by 1934 will publish Modern Housing, a book that deserves to be put into this context. Now this is a very ambiguous situation because it is often said that Philip Johnson had an aestheticizing and Hitchcock aestheticizing vision, and Catherine Bauer and Mumford were tolerated in their social vision, but yet the text on housing in this book, which is extremely interesting in the catalog of the exhibition, is by Henry Russell Hitchcock. So that dichotomy actually doesn't hold. And so that's one thing that I like to talk about in the essay. This is the proposal by Howland Lescaz for housing on Christie Street, Christie Forsyth, and there were tours organized for New York City government officials to come and see this project. So also the notion that the exhibition was only of completed work is not true, that it was only a aestheticizing mission. It had this advocacy role of trying to get improved housing actually built in New York City. The exhibition was photographs and rough and ready models, all built for the exhibition. None of them were brought from architectural offices, because here is its itinerary of all of the places it was going to go over the next 2 years. And just one view of how even more traditional it looks in the Cleveland Museum of Art by the fall of that year. So let's go back, and I just thought just in a few minutes I'll do this for you. It's somewhat entertaining to follow the life of this model. This model was sent by Walter Gropius. It was not involved in the design of the Bauhaus building in Dessau. It was built for his own exhibition proselytizing activities. So it's one of the few models in the show that was not brand new in January 1932, because it had previously been shown at the Werkbund exhibition in Paris, curated by Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and Herbert Bayer. They're going to return at the very end of our story. But what I find interesting about comparing it is at that moment, when you see how they dealt with this model, which is put on the floor in this cone of vision of photographs, this sense around, this notion, the Bauhaus actually taught exhibition design. And you see Philip Johnson as an exhibition designer in 1932. It's not exactly inspiring. Certainly this show looks incredibly conservative, although it was not what you expected in the Heckscher building. We could follow that model. There it is still in Paris in juxtaposition with this brilliant idea that Bayer and Breuer had to hang the chairs on the wall and express serial production in that way. This too, 1925, Friedrich Kiesler, an exhibition of building what became a city in space. This started out as an exhibition device for hanging photographs, and he thought it was so cool. He said, let's actually just display the exhibition device as a model city. So this experimental design in exhibition design in Europe in the 20s, in Paris, in Dessau, in Berlin, many other places, Prague, is not actually transferring initially to the 12th floor of the Crown building. But I think there's a bit of a shock that happens. The exhibition was made to be put in crates, sent around to work in Cleveland as well as New York. No mistake that it was in Cleveland, of course, that's where Philip Johnson was from, and as well as his stock in Standard Oil. And by 1934, the museum has moved out of these rental quarters into 11 West 53rd Street, a townhouse that belonged to the Rockefeller family. This is precisely the years in which the blocks to the west of Fifth Avenue are transforming. And that will remain, of course, the address. This is Philip Johnson doing a foretaste show of what an industrial design show could look like. He has become an exhibition designer with this extraordinary handling of springs and propellers and the like. One of the other great discoveries in Julia Kinchen's wonderful essay in the book is that almost none of these objects were actually literally objets trouvés, found on the street and put in place. They were all polished, re-chromed, cleaned up, painted. They were actually transformed. So what is often said, the radical act of putting the contents of an airplane hangar into a townhouse, now become an exhibition space, is a little bit of an exaggeration. But my point is that Johnson by this point has become an absolute brilliant impresario of display, not just of polemics. Here is the announcement on 34th Street of the exhibition in this townhouse. and won an advance on his very first trial exhibition, Decorative Objects of 1900 versus Useful Objects of Today, catchy title now, 1931, with these little displays. He borrowed his mother's Art Nouveau objects and put them next to the things he liked. But instead, we get this in machine art. Doesn't look like Macy's, looks actually much more like what Mies and Lily Wright are doing in German industrial arts exhibitions of the period. And Johnson, of course, was going back and forth, even in the early years, infamously, of the Nazi regime, so he knew those exhibitions. Probably the most radical exhibition that took place at 11 West 53rd while it was still a townhouse before it was demolished, beginning the museum's history of demolition as well as construction, is the housing exhibition of the city of New York of 1934. This was masterminded by Mumford with Catherine Bauer and others. Philip Johnson encouraged it enormously right before his departure into right-wing politics in Louisiana. Its most famous thing, it's not possible quite to make it out in this juxtaposition of murals, but you can see that the situation is degrading in this direction because the exhibition juxtaposed two rooms. One was a room of the townhouse as found, redesigned by Johnson with tubular steel furniture and the library that any New York family would want to have. It included, of course, a copy of the International style. The other was a room that had been removed from a tenement in Yorkville on East 87th Street and transported to the museum, complete with its dirty dishes and its roaches, which caused quite a fuss. So in the tradition of Pugin's contrasts, a future and a grimy past, an exhibition that played a role in legislation for housing, both in the municipal level in New York and in the federal government, and included a gallery in which a consultant on mortgage and financial affairs was available. So this idea of relational aesthetics that we hear so much about in recent times was actually pioneered perhaps by Catherine Bauer and Louis Mumford in the Museum of Modern Art. Our Bauhaus model returns, 1938. It is redeployed now by the exhibition designer Herbert Bayer, working with the guest curator Walter Gropius to stage the Bauhaus exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. Not on 53rd Street because the building has been demolished to prepare for the construction of a permanent home meant to be built and opened in time for the 1939 10th anniversary of the museum and in time to compete with the expected crowds coming for the New York World's Fair of 1939. So they were given rent-free space in one of the newly completed corridors, underground corridors, of the concourse of Rockefeller Center. So again, a very interesting contrast because the Bauhaus, Rockefeller Center, we're not so sure about how we feel about Rockefeller Center at MoMA, even though Breuer loved it. It was the first thing he photographed. And here we are looking through the shop window, which is now not a Metropolitan Museum of Art gift shop in the concourse, but rather the Museum of Modern Art display with the Bauhaus in the center, and then this absolutely... So look at this transformation from Johnson displaying to Bayer displaying the actual exact same model. This is a really wonderful moment. This is the guest book of the Museum of Modern Art. I don't think everybody who came was allowed to sign in, but it was a really fantastic moment. If we look over here, we're in 1937 during preparations, and so within a very short period, Marcel Breuer, Herbert Bayer, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and the Holy Nage are the people who are coming through and signing that incredible book. There is Herbert Bayer, photograph taken in the exhibition of his design. These are projects from the Bauhaus preliminary course that he recreated. There is once you're inside the space. And this, I think, is absolutely key to understand. To compare that model on its carryable tray inside the window with this photograph, quite well known at the period. This is Nazi stormtroopers carrying the project for the Museum of German Art, today the Haus der Kunst, in Munich, in a, as you can see, a Nazi parade on the triumph of German art that came right after the opening of the Degenerate Art exhibition. The Bauhaus exhibition in New York, of course, the Bauhaus has been closed for 5 years. It's not a contemporary art exhibition at all. It's a one part memento mori, one part political reaction to and declaration that America is going to harbor the Bauhaus as an act of artistic freedom against what is going on in Europe. When you read the catalog, that is absolutely clear. When you read the press, that is clear that that is meant to be a part of the perception of this show. So it's not an aesthetic show at all. It is a highly political show that is in reaction to this event in 1937, the exhibition of degenerate art in Munich, the infamous degenerate art exhibition. Here is the Herbert Bayer's incredible floor plan for that space with the entrance, and this wonderful attempt to figure out how people will move through exhibition space, which was one of his preoccupations through his life. Always hard to do, easier if you pick up your plan and make it into the linoleum on the floor. And he included all sorts of incredible things that he had learned on Broadway, like a peep show at the back, which you could look and see various things, and all sorts of absolutely incredible devices that were not only an example of his graphic design and exhibition design brilliance, but also dealing with the issue that many people had responded to them in their request for things to put on display. I'm sorry, I really can't get my stuff out of Germany right now. The correspondence, which I've read, the correspondence to this exhibition is extremely poignant. So here is Bayer, absolutely brilliant designer, photographing the show. There's Johnson's painting, thinking about all different perspectives and ways of strategies of bringing to life the objects in the exhibition, and tilting things in unusual ways, putting carpets on these wonderful zigzag things, making the exhibition lighting actually part of the theme of the show itself. An absolutely brilliant display that intrigued many, bewildered many more, and was also meant in part to travel, even though it couldn't in that form. I just thought I might bathe you in it. Was not, I said 1/2 memento mori, because interestingly, when you look at, very well photographed, when you start to look at the exhibition, you find this, a very, this looks like something that was made for the newly opened train show at the Bronx Botanical Garden. A model made by the students at Harvard of Gropius and Breuer's most recently completed project at Cohasset, Massachusetts, the Haggerty House, to show actually that the Bauhaus was having a renaissance and being reborn in American terms. And so we have in Rockefeller Center this example of an Americanized Bauhaus. Interestingly, in the lead up to building the building, there are any number of experiments. This is one of the proposals for a museum of modern art by the Scas. Johnson wanted Mies to build it, but ultimately this building that opened almost exactly at the same time as this building. This is the one you saw parading in the streets just a few minutes ago, the House of German Art in Munich on the Leopoldstrasse. And here, an old photograph of the museum. I particularly like this view. It might actually be taken from a building in Rockefeller Center, because it always seems to me, some of you have heard this, me lecture, probably heard this bad joke before, as though the museum was waiting for Corbusier to arrive, and when he did, inevitably in a plane, he would know exactly where to go. The first European tourist to take up the now habit of going from JFK Airport directly to the crowds at 53rd Street. So that, I think, culminates our story, because here is this Bauhaus international style building in America, manifestation of the principles of the 1932 show, or some of them by Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone, believe it or not. Rockefeller Apartments behind Harrison. But one has to understand it not only in contrast to the townhouses on either side, but I think also in an international perspective in relationship to the exhibition that was the last exhibition in a temporary space before the museum opened here in '39, in time for the World's Fair and in time for its 10th anniversary. And there the back facade, originally with the original Sculptures Garden, designed by one of Philip Johnson's successors, John McAndrew. It is also equally fascinating to me, and has been since I went to MoMA, to think about how consistent is the myth that Philip Johnson wrote the entire history of the architecture and design department. By the time I'm talking about here, Philip Johnson is gone. He's been exiled by the museum. There have been any number of curators. History has not retained very emphatically the incredible role of women curators in the architecture and design department, the extent to which there were probably more women in the architecture. Originally the separate architecture and industrial art, ultimately the merged, after 49, the merged industrial architecture and design department, than in any other department of the museum in the early years. Today that's no longer the case, but absolutely the history of the 1930s. And yet the myth persists that Philip Johnson was pulling these strings the whole time. He actually needed to go away. He's really absent from the museum from the end of 34 until 46, 47, when he comes back. I guess I should conclude the story there. I wanted to bring it full circle back to the Bauhaus, even though Johnson has by now dropped out. Barr is there. I thought you'd like to see the photograph of the back of the building as it had originally appeared with this glass brick, long gone, as well as a completely different a completely different sculpture garden. I still like to say that the sculpture garden is not a sculpture garden at all. It is the largest object in the collection of the museum, of the architecture and design department. It is a piece of architecture that was created by the museum and is in its collection. And I think that McAndrew thought that as well. It was opened in 39, but almost immediately in 39 was the context of how to compete with a type of exposition that seemed to be more popular than the exhibitions put on at MoMA, which were the World's Fairs, or the Exposition Universelle. Paris, with its threatening 1937 confrontation, New York, 1939. A World's Fair that made people at MoMA incredibly nervous, not only for attendance statistics, but also for the type of architecture that might predominate there. Thought to be commercial, kitsch, proto-postmodern, if you will. This actually posted the number of visitors that had been there. But most particularly was the planned, announced exhibition of the Town of Tomorrow, which the MoMA became so panicked about this that an exhibition was mounted on what a town of tomorrow should look like, hoping to influence that we wouldn't get this. This is second from that entrance to the Town of Tomorrow, house number 15, Levittown avant la lettre. Your guide, this is for you, Karen. Your guide to the Long Island Colonial House, and here are some of the others. The most advanced was the electrical house. It was George Washington with Westinghouse. And in retaliation, the museum decided to build a house in its garden. Its answer to the full-scale Bauhaus exhibition house, its answer to the trustees that you cannot show architecture because what would you show? Before the museum had ever collected any architecture in 1940, Frank Lloyd Wright was to design a very early version of the Usonian house that was meant to sit here as a complement to his exhibition on the ground floor. It was not built. The first house in the garden was this one. 1 year later, 1941, Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion deployment unit as war housing, fully furnished, but no interior photographs, unfortunately, that I found yet, by Bloomingdale's. And let's see, we conclude there. And of course, that is ultimately going to lead to the invitation by Johnson for his architecture professor at Harvard to come and design the first full-scale house in the garden that is not a deployment unit, the famous house in the garden, 1948 by Breuer in McAndrew's garden, and I think the final, therefore, realization of the Bauhaus project of the joint Department of Architecture and Design to pull together a full scale, a kind of modified international style show with a good design show. And I think maybe I will stop there, but that too was, of course, a polemical moment because it was right at the moment when Levittown was being advanced and right at the moment when another display was taking place on the corner of 52nd and 6th Avenue. This was the Lustron prefabricated house that put up its sales model 1 block from the Museum of Modern Art. A. Louise Huxtable was a curatorial assistant in the Department of Architecture and Design at the time, and I asked her about the Breuer house, and I asked her about references to this Lustron house that was going up at the same time, and asked her if she thought there was any connection. She told me 2 incredibly interesting things. One was that one of her jobs was to dust the Breuer house every morning. And the second was that Philip Johnson, relatively newly returned to the now soon-to-be fused departments of architecture and design, said, "Did you see the Lustron house? It is an offense to architecture, to modernism, and to the Museum of Modern Art." And thus was finally realized, in retaliation for this, the house in the garden of Marcel Breuer. So I think I'll end there. This is a wonderful quote from Margot Barr about her apartment. I've unpacked a great many things, and all the closets are in shape. All the drawers, she's writing to her mother, all the drawers lined, and everything has its allotted place so I can find it. I really don't approve of being in the least interested in household appurtenances, and have never felt impressed by such things before. However, this is about her apartment. It is all for the glory of the Museum of Modern Art. So we will end there. Thank God that PowerPoint loaded.
Yeah, thank God. You forgot some houses that were built in a courtyard next to MoMA that you commissioned.
Oh yes, but they're not in this time
No,
frame.
no, they're not. But I mean,
I thought you were going to say I forgot the houses that were up on the terraces.
No,
Center,
but I mean,
Macy's houses, and these houses there are a lot of houses going up.
So what degree of self-consciousness did you have in this lineage?
Total.
Okay.
Total.
Expected.
Because I realized that you know it here where you have a lot of models which are always fetching, but it's very difficult to get people to come and look at an architecture exhibition because the imagery of an architectural exhibition is very difficult for a lay audience, let's call it. But there's nothing people like more than visiting other people's houses. So if you can use the house as a way of demonstrating a point, which is partly what this was about, you can get a lot of people to come and think about architecture. So I was very conscious of the fact that the houses, the 3 houses in the garden in the late 40s, early 50s were among the best visited exhibitions of architecture before very, very recent times. And that is kind of carried up by the sheer number of people that are at MoMA on any given day. And of the 3, I'm not counting the deployment house, of the 3, the Marcel Breuer, the Gregory Ain, and then the Japanese house in the garden, by far the most successful was the Japanese house in the garden. By far.
I don't believe that.
I think home delivery. Yeah. I think home delivery was the most visited.
Well, yes, but at the number of people visiting the Museum of Modern Art in the early 21st century is off the charts compared to the number of people who were going in the 40s and 50s. Anyway, I took a lot of liberties of just embellishing around the book, but I hope I also gave you some sense of what its project and achievements are. Yeah.
You were very careful to attribute the architect or designer of everything, but there's one building you didn't mention, and that is the 1939 MoMA building, which I believe is in stone.
Yeah, it's Philip Goodwin. Oh, I thought I said that. Sorry, Philip Goodwin and Edward Rouse.
American architect.
Mm-hmm.
And could you say something about how that decision was made and how that, since it's quite a remarkable building?
Yes, well, Philip Goodwin was a trustee of the museum, so that was he had a kind of inside track in a way. And I don't know for a fact the others here in the audience who might have a better idea of it than I do. I do think that there were internal tensions between what various people wanted. Barr, I don't think that this was Barr's idea, but who knows what the discussion was in the trustees that ultimately led to a trustee doing it. Goodwin didn't build that much, but he had just finished a apartment house on the east side that was noticed by many as sort of going in a modernist direction. I didn't bring a photograph of it because I wasn't thinking that would come in, but I don't know. Maybe John knows, or Caroline, you know better the story of that commissioning. And I don't even know really the occasion, what led to the association between Stone and Goodwin. I'm not going to say any more about Stone because I might get stoned.
It's great.
Well,
Mhm.
It's great to see the back. I haven't seen that view of the back before. It almost looks better than this. But I was wondering, as you went through the architects that were in the early exhibition, it did remind me of something I've asked myself over the years. Whatever happened to the Bowman brothers? Who in the world were they?
Yeah, and that was, Johnson had all of his money on the Bowman Brothers and on Klaus and Dauber. Those were, and a little bit of a segue perhaps. When I went to MoMA, I became entrenched in the history of the department, not only because I'm a historian, so if I have privileged access to an archive, I try to do that the whole time, but because I became intrigued by a really, still I think, intriguing issue. Why is it that the museum's history is known through about 6 or 7 exhibitions when it has produced several hundred in architecture and design? And the exhibitions were very short duration initially. The idea too was that the museum renewed itself all the time. The international style show, so-called, was a relatively long run, but many of them were 4 or 6 weeks. So that means that there could be 8 architecture exhibitions. Well, often that would be an exhibition. I mean, they're not necessarily enormous. But many of them are forgotten, particularly the 1930s is a particularly fascinating moment because there was a master plan for how the exhibitions should work that was calculated on Hitchcock's books, and there was meant to be an alternation between trying to trace the genealogy of modernism back to the Roman Baroque with exhibitions that were contemporary. So always finding new talent, but writing the history of the present with in Hitchcock's terms, an even longer tail. There was meant to be a Schinkel exhibition, there was meant to be an Italian Baroque exhibition. All of these things were scheduled. The whole plan, in a sense, got tossed out when Johnson started working for Huey Long and was asked to leave. But Hitchcock had drawn up these various 5-year plans. That was a long prelude to tell you that there's an intriguing exhibition that happens very rapidly after the 32 show, I think end of 33 or maybe beginning of 34, called Young Architects of the Midwest. And these pick up on some of these young talents that are in the 32 show, but there's it is in 33, it may even be late 32, because the real intent of it is that these should be architects who should build for the Century Progress exhibition in Chicago in 1933. And if they can show the organizers of that exhibition that there are very young talents out there that Johnson has found in the Midwest, that there is no need to do a deco fair, you can get these young modernists and give them a building. They're laid out of the stable with it. So I do find that a preoccupation with the popular appeal of World's Fairs as having a nefarious effect on public taste.
And the Bowman brothers were present?
I'd have to look, but I think that the Bowman brothers were. The Bowman brothers were based in Chicago. And they had done that tower was for an unbuilt design for an apartment house in Evanston. Any other questions?
Johnson's interest in the Bauhaus, how simultaneous is that with his politics and being so enamored of the Nazis?
Well, they overlap obviously in 30. Well, they overlap really during the Mies period when Mies is himself needing to deal with the Nazis in a not always totally clear way. So I guess you could ask the question, how is that Johnson, in looking at the Gestalt pattern, can see the face in the vase at the same time? He can be enamored of the Bauhaus and actually follow the troops into Poland. And I don't think he necessarily sees a contradiction there. But I don't think that Johnson believes that architectural form is actually related to the form of politics. I think for him, really, architecture is a matter of taste. That might sound as though it contradicts what I said earlier. Doesn't mean that he's not interested in housing. It doesn't mean that he doesn't support Bauer, Mumford, although they don't always see eye to eye. Doesn't mean that he has no social conscience. I just don't think that he actually believes that that there's a contradiction between politics and that there's a contradiction between right-wing politics and what we think of as left-wing architecture.
Had Hitler's regime denounced the Bauhaus by that time or not yet?
Sure. I mean, technically, the Bauhaus closed itself so that the Nazis couldn't close it. That they, it's sort of like if a young couple is going to break up. This is one. There's a race to see who can do it first.
Any idea if that model is still around?
Which the Bauhaus model?
The Bauhaus model.
Oh yeah, it has a subsequent history as well, which is quite fascinating. The model exists in the Bauhaus archives in Berlin now. In the 50s, I believe, I found correspondence. Gropius writes from Harvard and says he's really horrified. He feels that the museum is not really behind what he's doing anymore, and moreover, they haven't shown this model for a very, very long time. Could he have it back? By this point, Drexler has arrived, and Drexler has a project that seems to have antecedents, but Drexler has a project to create a permanent gallery of architectural models all at the same scale. So he wants to do this kind of Beaux-Arts project of a study gallery of models, and so they all, and he picks a very weird scale. So all of these models need to be made to this scale that he picked. I can't remember what it is at the moment. There are quite a number of models in the collection that are at this strange scale. And of course that model is not at that scale, so it's not going to work in his project, so he doesn't even want to hold on to it, so it is given to Gropius. When Gropius is successful after the war in creating the Bauhaus archive, first in Darmstadt, he gives, the model was meant to go to the Busch-Reisinger, he gives it, which is the German art museum at Harvard, he gives it to the Bauhaus archive as one of the early gifts to create this historical archive, kind of memorial to the Bauhaus in West Germany. So when Leah Dickerman and I did the Bauhaus exhibition in 2009, we wanted to borrow it back, but we weren't allowed to because we were told it is too fragile to travel. Irony, and then he said, anyway, you have the model that was made by the museum to replace it when you gave it, when Gropius, was given the model back. Which is true, but it is one of Arthur Drexler's models, and I think his models are absolutely hideous. And they're also all the colors on the Bauhaus were wrong. They're made out of these shiny materials. I mean, I'll show it to you sometime if you want to see it. You can see if you agree with me. It's kind of disgusting. So we didn't want to show it. So we had this terrible problem. We couldn't. I really wanted this Gropius model. I mean, not that Gropius himself made it, but so if you want to see it, it is on permanent display in the Bauhaus archive in Berlin, in the permanent exhibition on the history of the Bauhaus. But as you can see, it has somebody should write its biography.
Obviously, among the cross currents of thought in the 20s, the Bauhaus was far and away the most important. But there were also the Russian constructivists in that period that were very prominent, original, and powerful. Did they enter into this flow of ideas at all? Even though I know that Hitchcock and Johnson did not go to Russia.
No, but Barr did.
But Barr did.
that quote that I read you by Barr about the Bauhaus, he's actually on his way to Moscow. And he wrote a very, very interesting diary from Moscow that's been published. I think it was in October, the magazine October, appropriately enough. But I just want to get back to his eye chart, because that deals with your question, and I don't know how to go back to the, so we just get to see history in reverse. It's a good review for the exam. We're going to get there any minute now. Yes. Aren't the Russians here?
Yes.
Constructivism Moscow, directly to the Bauhaus.
But through the Bauhaus.
Could have taken it, if he was interested in Hannes Meyer, he would have taken it back out, because Meyer takes the whole group that leaves the Bauhaus with him in 30, that forms the Red Brigade, that goes from Dessau to Moscow. I mean, in this way, the Museum of Modern Art is complicit with the trifurcation of the history writing of the Bauhaus, because each of the directors of the Bauhaus, and others as well, tried to write their own history of it. So by this point, MoMA is completely making common cause with Gropius. That is why the exhibition in 1938 was called Bauhaus 1919 to 1928. The Bauhaus closed in 1933. Gropius, Bayer, and Breuer, partly with Barr's assistance, write out the two subsequent directors. Hannes Meyer is gone, as is Mies van der Rohe. Hannes Meyer, by that time, had been and was on the way of returning from Moscow. That was a bit of a fiasco in the end. But Meyer had gone off on his own. He had his own Bauhaus. He had his own Bauhaus circulating exhibition. Mies was in Chicago with Moholy, who he could barely stand. And Moholy was setting up the new Bauhaus in Chicago, which ultimately got fused into IIT, where Mies was the director. So at this point, Mies and Meyer's Bauhaus is not present. Had Johnson not been persona non grata at the museum in 1938, I'm not so sure that would have happened, because he absolutely was the champion of Mies van der Rohe in America. John?
And following up on that, the apartment, I assume that's entirely long gone. What became of the Mies furnishings that Johnson had in his apartment?
Some of them are in the collection, some of them some of them are in the glass house. And then the bar furniture, you saw the little, I'm trying to remember her name now, she's the only daughter of Alfred and Margot, who's a wonderful person, she's still around, and I'm blanking on her name, begins with V. And you see her, she's a baby in the maybe go back to her. I'm thinking Victoria, but this is terrible because I've met her many times. She, and this was before my time, or I would not have allowed it to happen, she gave the furniture to the Montreal Museum.
Was Barr from Montreal, is that?
Probably the preface recounts the reason for this connection. I think the connection might be through David Hanks. There's Johnson's furniture. And where's the picture? It should be identified. Oh, I guess I took it out. I was trying.
I don't remember seeing.
No, I didn't show. She's in the book. If you look in that chapter, she's in the book. I think it's Victoria. Anyway, she gave the furniture. She had it. She gave it to the Montreal Museum. And it is the genesis of this whole exhibition project, is to make the case for this furniture, which is why Delmuth Albrecht writes this very beautiful essay in the book about Bohemia, and this is very rarefied Bohemia, but Bohemia and sociability in New York in the late 20s and 30s, and tries to create a social setting for this and all of the people who would have come through these two apartments.
Speaking of the two apartments, is there any story to the fact that they were both in the same building, one apartment directly above the other, or was it just chance?
I think the Barrs moved in first and alerted Johnson that there was a unit in the building. You know, they were extremely close friends already before MoMA. They knew one another from the Harvard days, and, you know, and all the and already during the Wellesley days of Barr. As you probably know, Barr was the first person ever to teach a course in modern art at Wellesley. And he didn't invite Johnson, but he invited Hitchcock to lecture in that course. So they all knew one another before they got through the Harvard Society. They had also actually, to have the 3-hour version, they had actually already staged a Bauhaus exhibition before the whole Museum of Modern Art story.
I didn't gather, was the furniture made in Europe and shipped in Germany or wherever?
This
Or
was.
was it made in New York?
No, this was
Or-
made. This is made in Germany and shipped.
Yeah, I would think, because Kratz Industries later
Yeah.
worked with these, I thought maybe they were businesses.
No, these are, but this is what Wolf Tegethoff has been doing a study of the Barcelona Chair, because the Barcelona Chair, they could not figure out how to produce it industrially, because the key problem of the Barcelona Chair, one of its great beauties, is that it makes you unaware of this problem, which is how does that member intersect that member? You know, how is that possible? It's just not possible. Metal can't, you know, it's physics involved. So there's a very, very complicated joint that takes place there that has to be micromanaged and micro-engineered to make it disappear in the chroming. And we have drawings that show some of the possible connections, but what Tegethoff has been doing is having them, whenever he can convince people who we can document that it is a 1929, 30, 31 production, to allow these to be x-rayed, and they're all different. And so each one is hand-produced, and each one is trying to figure out how to do that. You know, it was only Knoll. Was it Knoll who did it? Or I think Knoll, after the war, who figured out. You know, the Barcelona Chair was never produced in great numbers. I mean, you can count maybe at most, you know, 20 or 30 of them were actually produced in this period. They were extremely rare, and they're extremely expensive. And if you've ever picked one up, they are extremely heavy. They are the antithesis of Breuer furniture. And they are the antithesis of the furniture that the Barrs had, you know, with their marriage and their kid, and all of it can be moved around, and it's exactly what tubular steel furniture is supposed to be, lightweight, modern, movable, whereas Mises' furniture is so monumental it's impossible to move, and the evidence for it is that Mies always draws the furniture on the plan. You're not supposed to move it. He draws where it's supposed to be, including all the drawings which we have at MoMA of this apartment are furniture plans as well.
But they're always paired, they're never skewed like that.
Yeah, that might be. I wonder, I should look at the plans again and see if that's Johnson having a moment of caprice.
There's a very good visual sense of East 52nd Street. Is that Emery Roth building still there? It's still there?
That building, yes.
It's still there?
Yeah.
How long did they have the apartments?
Don't remember, but it is all in the essay when they moved out.
Hopefully footnote 2 is living there now.
Good. Well,
I
thank
think
you.
we demonstrated the inexhaustible knowledge of this topic. So,
Really, the last question was, I don't know.
okay, well.
But you know, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said, knowledge is knowing or knowing where to find out. It's in that book.
Exactly. So you can ask him some more, but you can also have a glass of wine or
I think that's a very good idea.
That's fantastic. So interesting. Few, excellent, okay. And please come back, because once a month we do an author's talk on the subject of New York history, urban history, art history, of New York history. And we've had a wonderful series of talks, and we always have the very best authors in this situation, as you can see. So, I'm really happy tonight to be able to impose on my friend Barry Bergdoll's time. And as he was just disclosing, he's a connected author for this book for an essay, which will, of course, be the favorite essay in the most New York, really, of all of the essays in terms of modern architecture. But before we get to the specifics and the disclaimers on the larger exhibition, of which this is a part and precedes by quite a lot, and a really beautiful book. I mean, it's really extraordinary design values and production that you see in this Monticelli Press collection. I wanted to say that I remember being about 30 years old and going to watch Woody Allen's Manhattan. They're all sitting around in a coffee shop or something, and they said, "We've been friends for 25 years." And I thought, whoa, somebody's been friends for 25 years, and it was just inconceivable to me. Well, Barry and I have been friends for at least 30 years, and I'm reminded by the little bio that he started teaching at Columbia 30 years ago, in 1986, which is really extraordinary to think about. But I knew him even before that, when we were all in graduate school together at Columbia. And it was, so we have a lot of wonderful personal history that goes back in art history. But we always also have a kind of historiography, which is particularly pertinent tonight, because when I was studying modern American architecture of the 1920s and 30s, it was this exhibition that Barry wrote about, the international, what became the international style in the book, but modern architecture and international exhibition that was put together by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock, which was the antithesis, the avant-garde modernism of the modernists that I was studying, of Raymond Hood and Hugh Ferris and Harvey Wiley Corbett. And so my architects were the rejected architects in this narrative of modernism, where they were the losers, for sure, not the winners. And it was this famous exhibition, the subject of Barry's talk tonight, which is really the central event around which modernism gets defined in a direction, in a trajectory in American architecture, I think, having already been international modernism. So that historiography of the 1980s and things people were studying, I think I was very symptomatic of a kind of cycle of a 50-year retrospective of, a generation past begins to look at people who are just a little bit older than they are and sort of rethink that issues. And now, 30 years later, revisiting it again. So this is, in a lot of ways, coming home to a topic with, we'll see, a fresh perspective on that. But, of all the kind of perfect alignments of moments, in this famous example of when we were studying in the 1980s, this exhibition of the 1930s, it was Philip Johnson and Alfred Barr, of course, that were the central figures. And now, who should at the Museum of Modern Art, and now who should it be speaking tonight, but now the former chief curator of the Museum of Modern Art, who carried the title of Philip Johnson Curatorship in the Department of Architecture and Design. So there's this incredible kind of stepping stones or connect the dots in which, Barry, you've triumphed in the entire kind of historical cyclicity of the interest in this topic. So with that, Barry, tell us about 1931-32.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carol.